Okay, so let's talk about Deus Ex, the original Deus Ex. And, despite it being a game that was released back in 2001, the game itself has many, many different, secrets that regard what I think a lot of people don't understand about like the way the game was really originally programmed, whether that be scrapped ideas or due to time constraints. A lot of ideas were changed and they had to finalize what they had basically. So one of the things that really kind of interested me was not just the story but the in-depth like lore that you would really kind of have to see unfold before your eyes that was out in the open. Again, like the old saying goes, the easiest way to hide something is out in the open. So Deus Ex had like many different characters, one of them being Paul Denton. Now, I feel Paul Denton, even though he was JC Denton's older brother, we never really got to see what his true intention was. You eventually figure out sort of what he was after, but there seems to be a lot more that's still missing from that, that lore. What was he originally after? Like, how did he discover what he did through the people he did? Kind of like as if they could have wrote like a Paul Denton side of the story. You play as Paul Denton and you get to really see like how he found out the conspiracy and all that too. How like Majestic 12 was really a thing, and how UNACO, the UN, was actually working with the private corporations. They were creating, along with Bob Page, they were creating the the Gray Death, and then they were, at least out in the public, saying, hey, we got the cure for it, or we're finding a way to cure it, but they're just holding it, So Paul Denton went through all this trouble. He found something, and then they eventually tried to stop him. And there's even been some scrap concept designs I found where like even Walton Simons would personally assassinate like Paul Denton if he was if you didn't save him up until a certain point. Originally, in the way the game worked in the original version, they were going to try to send you to Hong Kong and take out Tracer Tong, but you eventually found out that, they were going to send the MIBs, the Men in Black, to try to assassinate Paul in his apartment because they've already deactivated. They basically had him right where they wanted, They disabled all his special abilities and all he had, and he was already in, like, really bad condition with what they were going to do with the kill switch. So either the kill switch was going to kill him, or they were just going to be like, hey, you know what? Let's just send a platoon of people against him and just assassinate him right where he stands. Drop him right where he stands, and then that'd be the end of Paul Denton. They'd cover it up and say, you know what? Job well done, But really, he knew too much. He knew a lot, and again, if you actually dig into the story of Paul Denton a little bit, even some of the troopers didn't believe anything that the higher-ups were saying. They believed that Paul was just trying to do the right thing. Whatever it was he was after, I hope he does accomplish it, Keep thinking that he will. One of the troopers, they were talking about, like, VersaLife, Bob Page's industry, and what they were really after originally, trying to think, what were they really after? A lot of the stuff they were covering up, they were hiding, and they were trying to figure out, like, what's the whole point of a government, and, like, where does it originally stand? You gotta protect your industries, you gotta protect your priorities. So that's what they were basically trying to do with, like, UNACO and all that. They were trying to argue, but really UNACO was actually just tools of Majestic 12 that were hand-me-downs from the Illuminati, their parent company. And what ended up happening was, like, and here's where it gets really confusing. Paul Denton doesn't really come out and say, like, what all the things he went through right offhand. For example, like, we find out, like, the way the story originally goes. You play as J.C. Denton, his younger brother. First day on duty, and quite an interesting and a hell of a first day, like one of the UNACO troopers says. You find yourself storming Liberty Island. You start out in Liberty Island, which is New York City, basically, where the Statue of Liberty is. And the NSF, the goal of the game, they started off really, is they start stating that the NSF have overtaken a shipment of ambrosia, and you're basically an undercover operative who is left with the task of trying to figure out, like, what to do next. Where, who is the NSF? How do we stop the NSF? And where are they taking this ambrosia? Well, keep this in mind. So the ambrosia is actually the cure for, well, it's a temporary cure for said virus. So, but with what has been known to the public, people have been fighting over it, and obviously the NSF have been trying to get their hands on it. Well, depending on, the skills and the routes you decide to take in the game, you basically, you meet up with Paul on the docks. Paul mentions how they sent him back to New York. He was previously in Hong Kong, so there's stuff that he was doing. Because keep in mind, Paul is older than JC. He's been around. He's been in UNACO for years, maybe like, 7, 8 years? I forget exactly. Keep this in mind too. So Paul Denton was stating that, it's a long story why they sent him back, and he, you didn't want to hear the whole story, but JC insisted. He wanted to know what happened, who was he, what's going on. So you found out that JC Denton was originally, what happened was he didn't believe his brother was telling the truth. Like, he thought that, there was more to that story than what he was saying. So basically you find out that he originally was in Hong Kong. He originally was supposed to take out one of the he messed up an assassination attempt on one of the triad leaders. Later on, you find out that, a lot of the stuff that Paul did, he probably did it intentionally. Later on, you find out he's a double agent, and he had very good reason for being a double agent, and he wanted you to join him later on too, because he wanted to test your abilities just to see if you were ready for it. And then later on, you eventually prove him wrong, and you do eventually become just as clever as he is, if not better. And you start to really, like, as the game progresses, you start to figure out what Paul really was getting at, and you actually succeed in where he went wrong and more. So basically, this is what we find out. So the concept that we're going to be talking about is that Paul was originally trying to assassinate Bob Page from the very beginning. But the problem was, though, we didn't have direct proof, because we didn't have the proof that Bob Page was really the one behind the conspiracy. So basically, a little bit of research. So Bob Page, in the public eye, is a philanthropist. He gives a lot of money to charities. He gives a lot of money to, the wealthy. But as we find out, Bob Page is really secretly, he works behind the curtains. He's actually real evil too. If you actually watch the opening cinema of Deus Ex, you're greeted with two people working in like an undercrowded area, and it was Bob Page to the left and Walton Simons to the right. Their dream was to, they wanted people to fight each other, and then they would move in and slowly take over from the very beginning. So there was no reason to believe that they were gonna override everything, basically. So Bob Page basically had it put out like, they wanted to originally shut down the U.S. government, and then they wanted to move in with outside influence, like some sort of like globalism, totalitarian government. But eventually, thanks to people like Bob Page and like their underground projects, they had like their superhuman augmentation projects. Like Bob Page had Paul Denton originally, and then JC Denton, and it's interesting because if it's true that Paul Denton was actually working against Bob Page from the very beginning, kind of like how JC Denton would ironically be the one that kills Bob Page, regardless of what ending you get. That was the biggest mistake that Bob Page made. He created a bunch of, him and a bunch of people create a bunch of technofirms, created a bunch of augmented super soldiers, and eventually, they had ways of, like even, it's kind of like what was it Reyes? Jaime Reyes once said, UNACO never trusted even their own mechs, like Anna Navarre or what was the other one? Gunther. So they had like their own kill phrases, and even like Paul Denton and JC themselves had their own, or you could even Alex Denton even had the same thing in Invisible War, sort of. But I've never played Invisible War to the point where I don't think they've activated a kill switch. I don't even think so. But you could argue though that that was probably an idea, though. They had a kill switch kind of pre-installed in their mentality. And if you don't know what a kill switch is, it's basically like they'd say, like, you say a kill phrase, they die instantly. But for JC and Paul, it was kind of more complicated. So it was like a 24-hour period, and then your brain would implode on itself and then explode, sort of. Like what was it, like how Reyes explained it with Gunther. You say Laputin machine, and then like within, it was like 14 million or something, like electronites go off, and then it just boom, kills them instantly. It just blows up, basically an explosion. And you don't even have to kill him. Like, you don't even have to fight him. You could just be like, well, okay, he's dead now. It's like a self-destruct mechanism, just in case. A safe switch, basically. So basically, they did the same thing with Paul Denton. Paul didn't trust what they were doing undercover. So basically, he was working, like, because again, he was working with in Hong Kong. He worked with the Illuminous Path eventually. He eventually uncovered, he was a double agent towards Maggie Chow. She was a double agent towards Majestic 12. You also had that drunk that was in one of those bars in Hong Kong, and he mistakes J.C. Denton for Paul. This is when you kind of start figuring out, hey, maybe Paul really was up to he really was up to something, So basically, Paul stated that he found stuff. He found that VersaLife was eventually, like, doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. You eventually found out that J.C. Denton was gonna eventually succeed in what Paul didn't. Like Tracer Tong even stated, your brother's failure in New York has left me with nothing. And that's what he was trying to figure out was, he was trying to find the skeptics of the, because from what I understand, I gather that where Paul Denton went wrong was he was trying to figure out the research in North America. He was trying to also figure out the research in Hong Kong. Because like Tracer Tong says, the real research took place in North America. However, all the manufacturing and their backup data was done in VersaLife Corporation. But you didn't know that unless you actually gained access to the level 2 laboratories and all that. And once you finally did, there was all that security and all that. There was even the MIBs that were, they stated where, they don't recall being informed of any visitors. And they're talking about how, like, they're keeping a close eye on you. And, you go, and even if you go to VersaLife and you snoop around their security where, like, all the cops are, if you read the backlogs there, they started talking about how, they keep a very close eye on everybody who comes in there, but like in the open, they're sitting here talking about how, you don't need a pass or anything, but they're keeping a close eye on you because they don't share the technology, because they're hiding something, right? What was VersaLife hiding in the level 2 labs? The universal constructor that was responsible for creating the Gray Death to begin with. Who owned VersaLife? Bob Page, right? So yeah. Oh, and there's even that conversation you can find if you don't kill Maggie Chow in her apartment where she's talking to Bob Page. Technically, they don't notice you, but you can overhear them talking. So if you don't start shooting at all the guards because they're not programmed to see you and to start attacking right away, you'll go in there and you can hear them talking about how they have plans for some of the future objectives they're trying to accomplish, especially with like the nanotech technology that they were developing and all that. And so Bob Page obviously knew a lot more than he was leading on, and obviously so, he was a philanthropist. He was a very, very wealthy man, but he also had a lot of people that worked for him. Because like the NSF terrorist once said at the very beginning of the game, corporations are so big, you don't even know who you're working for. That's terror built into the system, right? Who has the most money? The most corrupted people, right? So yeah, go figure. So Bob Page basically was one of the most wealthy individuals in the world, but nobody really knew who he was outside of the public. They just thought he was just a man who was trying to find a cure for a disease and help people out. But come to find out, he was actually the man that was behind it, creating, with the second man, basically trying to create, take advantage of, labor laws, creating embargoes. Again, like they say in Hong Kong, the last true sovereign nation in the world, as far as like the Luminous Path and the Red Arrow were stating, like Gordon Quick and Max Chan, for example. They were stating that you without the import restrictions, and while, they could, like Gordon Quick say, he's like the Illuminous path could import penguins from Norway and say they came from Japan, and they're sitting there like going back and forth talking about how they both don't know, like, who's got a bigger deal than the other one, and so they're basically trying to work out a business contract as they're like, they invite you there to they invite you back to the Lucky Money for like drinks and all that after you go through what was it after you go through VersaLife the first time. You get the ROM encoding data, so that way they can form the truce and all that. And so yeah, basically it was really interesting, because it was Maggie Chow that started that war, so Majestic 12 could move in and, take over. But they found out that wasn't true. And then later on, like with the Super Freighter, for example, what was left of, the Gray Death virus that was previously owned by Standout. Again, like Harley Philman would say, yeah, most of Majestic 12 were just hand-me-downs from, the Illuminati. And they were just, they found a way to get around the Illuminati, seized control, took advantage of them, put Stanton down and Morgan Everett on the run. And then eventually, but eventually you found a way to, get rid of Majestic 12 altogether after you kill Bob Page. But the problem was, though, before all this was going on, you found out that Bob Page was really not up to any good. But they didn't have any hardcore proof. And so JC, obviously, basically that's how Deus Ex would go. Paul Denton was basically, JC basically succeeded in where his brother didn't, because he probably believed that, Paul Denton wouldn't, they didn't believe that Paul would pull it off right away. But then eventually they figured, his brother would probably be able to, because they started realizing his brother was actually he caught on a lot faster than Paul did, and he actually had better luck too. Because, because you think about it, because even, gameplay aside, like with bosses and all that, like in Majestic 12, like as far as the story goes, they sent an army after JC, couldn't stop him. They sent a kill switch after him, couldn't stop him. They sent the highest ranking Majestic 12 members after him. They still couldn't stop him. And that's what happened, So they did teach him how to fight very well. And so what else was there? So yeah, Paul Denton knew ahead of time that was going to be his goal. He knew that Majestic 12 was a higher up from, the Illuminati, one of the hand-me-downs of the secret societies were actually in control of UNATCO. And actually the way Juan Lebedev was explaining it to him, he basically stated that, yes, there are, in fact, big corporations out there that were actually in control of just the UN, and UNATCO were just a couple of their tools. And so, like they would explain it later on too, basically the way we look at it now, it's like we were just trying to figure out like where Paul went wrong for the most part. So Paul Denton, like, okay, so if he found out that Majestic 12 was the one that was basically behind all of, they were basically the reason why that's what happened in the game. So then later on we would find out that, if Majestic 12 was behind all of it, then it must have been Bob Page too. So it would have made sense that that's originally what Paul Denton was trying to do. He was trying to find a way to stop Bob Page. He was basically trying to figure out, he was basically trying to find all the information that nobody else had uncovered. But again, if you ever play Deus Ex, like there's nothing in that game that clearly stated that, I mean, unless you think about it, that Paul Denton knew specifically that Majestic 12, because really the only thing we hear from him is that we don't really see that it was Bob Page. Like he was trying to say that was, like he knew that Majestic 12 was basically trying to take over the world. And after he found out like who Walton Simons was, he's like, because, you might remember like, before Paul Denton showed up at the, when JC Denton showed up at his doorstep in the apartment in the Ton Hotel, you found out that, you know, he was trying to gather up all that information about, you know, who Walton Simons was. I mean, he got as far as getting into their data logs. They found the name, but they didn't know much about the organization. But once he started finding out who was behind it, that was basically Paul Denton's, like, you know, major influence, was he's trying to stop their leader. And at first it kind of looked like it was Walton Simons, but Walton Simons was actually the second highest in command, and Paul Denton didn't stand a chance. Well, you could sort of say Paul Denton probably could have took out Walton if he had the right upgrades. But, you know, but the problem is, though, you know, after what JC went through and all the target practice, he was basically being put under, you know, you basically could say that's why he basically could take out Walton Simons and Jace, and you know, that's why Paul Denton probably would have been assassinated early on. Because it's interesting, because like, while not in the final version of Deus Ex, like the final release, like the PS2 and the PC version, you actually find out that Paul Denton either gets killed by the raid in the apartment if you go out the window, but if you actually kill yourself or have them kill you, you automatically just get teleported to the Majestic 12 prison, or underground UNACO, basically. So Paul's still alive, but he does survive the raid. But what happens is you find out that, you know, Walton Simons and basically Bob Page are the ones that are working for him, you know. So they rebel against it, and they're just trying to find a way to, like, you know, get him out of there as soon as possible. But I think it's really interesting, though, because, like, a lot of this stuff, you can miss a lot of the stuff in this game, but you really have to, like, really look for it. Like, not just the underground records and all that, not just the hacking of the info links and all that, but you also have to, like, really think about, like, you know, how much lore goes into Deus Ex. Like, who was what was it, like Paul was, like, you could say Paul was sort of scared in a way, because, you know, from Paul's perspective, he was created in a lab like JC, and eventually all this stuff does get explained. You know, just before you kill Bob Page, you know, once all of Majestic 12 is basically already dead, and, you know, you basically have, like, before you take that first step into that last room, before Bob Page is, like, trying to convince you that there's nothing you can do now, like, you know, he's already augmented and there's no way he can die. But how do you kill Bob Page if you go for, like, the Illuminati ending, for example? You do what, you know, you just reverse his nuclear fusion reactors, you push a button, and it causes it to blow up, and using nuclear energy kills Bob Page, and everything that he's accomplished is gone. So basically, a bunch of hand-me-downs and all that. So basically, like Gary Savage would also say, you know, what was it, like, oh god, okay, so he basically was saying, like, well, we don't want complete economic freedom if it means total economic collapse. He says, well, you know, there's got to be another way. So they're just thinking, well, you know, what if they put, like, someone like Morgan Everett in charge for a while, and then, you know, but they just took out they took out Bob Page. So now you would still have the same problem, but just on a little bit larger scale. So Bob Page was out of the picture, Majestic 12 is gone, and then, you know, of course, Majestic 12 slowly faded away. But now, you know, now you have the Illuminati returning to power if you went for that segment, and then, like, Bob, you know, and like Morgan Everett would say, you know, they would insinuate, influence, and suggest. You know, they never touch anything directly. It's only, you know, the world must know by now, Everett, what we've done. And then he's like telling them, well, know what? Only that the long night is over, you know. But he's like, so all sins are forgiven, you know, including yours. And he starts talking about, like, you know, after all the things he's been through, you know, like, because he basically, you know, they tried to kill him multiple times, and none of them could kill him. He survived one of the, and if you think about it, it's ironic. You know, J.C. Denton was, in theory, one of the greatest video game characters that was ever created. I mean, like the adventure he goes through, the people he like. I mean, debate if you want to say saved, met, or killed. Like the amount of odds that were stacked against him. Like he went through what his brother tried to achieve and what he failed, and he found out how to solve that problem, and he got that done. Like and it's ironic because he was originally created by Bob Page, and he was the one that killed Bob Page in the end, because that's where Bob Page went wrong. That was the one thing he underestimated. He spent $50 billion at least creating. Bob Page created Paul Denton as one project, and then they created JC, and then maybe sued. And like Walton Simons would say early on, we don't need Paul Denton. We got his brother, and more are on the way. So like the cloning, they're talking about like the cloning machines they had and all that. And then later on, you started finding out that like who else was there? Paul Denton was basically trying to reach the public by telling them, say, hey, listen, there's a lot of things that go on here that a lot of people don't see, and they had proof that something wasn't right. And eventually they found out through records or found out through people that Majestic 12 really wasn't just a conspiracy, but it was also like, there's a lot that goes on in the dark that a lot of people don't see. And, they always try to lie to people. And again, I think that's why Majestic 12, as well as like the Illuminati, like even in real life, if you want to talk about like real life secret societies, like why the, Deus Ex was like, that's why a lot of people loved it, because it really was like, if you get into politics, you really can see that, like George Carlin once would say, politicians are liars. You can't believe what they say. They try to cover everything up. They are basically the reason why everybody has problems for the most part, why society's rigged, or big corporations try to control everything. Or what was it? I'm trying to think. One of the mole people in Battery Park once said that, or no, it was Curly of the Underworld. Yeah, Curly would always say that, that's the problem with governments. When you have a country with millions of people, nobody has any say. And then you got the country would grow so big, and then eventually their governments would get so corrupt they collapse under their own weight, and they couldn't be stopped. So that was proof in and of itself that that Bob Page not only was up to no good, but it also proved that even Paul probably knew that, because once he got as far as finding out who Majestic 12 was and who the higher ups were, that's why they wanted to get rid of him, because he knew too much. And even the people that were lower down knew who he was as well. That was proof right there that there was a problem coming, and only so many people were even prepared to fight that war, let alone the mission that would soon befall them all. Later on, they would override that. And it's crazy because even the way Deus Ex originally ends, it kind of makes you wonder if it really is the right thing to do, because it's such a weird position to be in. You get rid of the corrupt people, but then it's like you have a bigger problem on your hands. Like, like the Helios ending. You had this artificial AI that merged with another existing AI from a previous program that they were trying to rush out and kill. It merges with another entity and forms another supercomputer AI, again, Helios in this case. And then you find out that they were, he merges with JC because he's like a lot more superior than Bob Page is, even with his latest augmentations. He doesn't, like Helios said himself, he didn't wish to merge with Bob Page. He felt like, JC Denton would be that individual, and he told him, like, you can be yourself, you will be who you'll be. But he wanted to examine like what was going on. And then eventually they found out JC couldn't control what was it, Helios. So eventually they found out, well, we're just gonna have to seal Helios away. But they put JC Denton in stasis, and it wouldn't be until like Invisible War where they finally got him out of stasis, where he eventually had his plan where, he wanted to create, like, he basically wanted, like Alex Denton, when he plays Alex Denton, from what I understand, he talked about how he wanted to build like this ancient city and all that. And like after he eventually figured out how to perfect like, you know, people and trying to get them to take responsibility, you know, they could finally live in some kind of perfect utopia. Because what's the problem with humanity? Why? What's the difference? Like say there's a God and they created free will, right? Deus Ex was always focused on the idea that, like in the words of Helios, humans created government because they like the checks and balance systems of like the United States stated that because they realized that they themselves were too irresponsible to be governed. That's why they needed other entities to be able to keep an eye on them. And that's why, you know, while it wasn't perfect, it was the way it was. It was to give the people more of a secondary chance, just in case something went wrong with one side of the government, could overthrow that side. And they couldn't get away with it. You know, it was actually a well thought out idea that actually took more planning if they wanted to try to get around it, whether through bribes or money or you know, some kind of just power and force, rather. So it's interesting, you know, what Deus Ex taught us and all the hidden lore that's behind it. I believe that there's a lot more that's hidden in this game, but this is just one thing that, you know, we probably should talk about. Again, Paul Denton was sort of like a mystery character. You know, he was there from the beginning, but at the same time, though, as time went on, you eventually found out not only was he telling the truth, but he also like knew how to play everybody else as a double agent, you know, with what he was trying to do. Not because he was evil or he had his own agenda, but he was trying to get out. He was trying to give the people what they really wanted, and he was trying to figure out how they could, you know, do the right thing by taking out the wrong people. The people that were wrong to begin with, basically. Not he was wrong, but the people that were corrupted, like Walton Simons, and you can sort of see why another reason why Deus Ex was a really good series was because they basically, you know, they had all the good stuff going on. You know, it'd be like a revenge story too, and an adventure you would never forget. You know, like they killed your brother, and you found out that he was actually right. You found out who was responsible, and now they were next on the list, you know, of the hit list. We like to think like JC was an assassin when necessary. But it's yeah, it's interesting how they wrote that. Like, and there's so many scrapped ideas they had that, you know, well, like there was like a mission 13 and a mission 14. No, Mission 7 and a Mission 13 that were missing from the final version of the game. Mission 7 was supposed to be like a slave trade. You were supposed to like be on like a sampan. Like that's a sailing boat, basically, where they carried a lot of imports. And you basically had to figure out like how to stop Majestic 12 from like getting you when you were escaping and all that. And then later on you would find out like this is where it kind of got interesting. This is where it gets really confusing. As far as like how the game was supposed to be a lot longer, but like at the same time the ending was different. Because if you don't know this, Majestic 12 no, let me rephrase that. Deus Ex as a series was supposed to be right around the idea of what was it? The people who originally created Deus Ex. It was about, you know, like lore of like what life is, policies and politics, the way people live their lives, what makes people happy, progress, how you realize what life is, sacred, you know, like, and you had like aliens on other planets they bring up every once in a while, and then they started talking about like gods and all that, you know. Kind of reminds me, okay, this is kind of a little off topic, but I'll kind of bring it up in a different aspect. Kind of reminds me of like the deep lore of like Norse mythology, you know, like with Thor, Surt, Asgard, Midgard, Loki. Again, if you remember like the movies and all that, like, you know, Thor, Loki, you see like what he went through and all that, and or even like if you want to talk about video game series like Valkyrie Profile, for example, if you ever played it, Star Ocean, you know, they talk about how there's life on other planets. They talk about what life is, and they talk about how there's gods and how everything's infinite. You know, you go to like an infinite number of dimensions, and then like they have a creator, there's a creator for them, and you know, it's just never ending, you know, so it kind of makes you wonder like what is really the answer to everything, you know, the God particle, basically. And that's kind of like how I felt like that's like the mystery of Deus Ex you're trying to figure out. You're trying to figure out all the things you don't know. You know, who you are, what's really worth fighting for, you know. Kind of reminds me of that song by Bryan Adams. It's not, you know, worth fighting for. What was that? Yeah, but anyways. But yeah, Deus Ex, man, like the ideas, the people that worked on it, man, they were way ahead of their time, man. Like even like in Mission 13, believe it or not, in 14 and 15 were actually supposed to be a lot different. You might remember in the final version of the game, keep this in mind. You might remember how like when you rescue Tiffany, Gary Savage's daughter in this case. Gary Savage's daughter was kidnapped by Majestic 12 and they were by Bob Page too. And basically at that point in the game, what happened in the final version was Bob Page talked about how his mission was failing, but he found a way to buy himself some more time. Somehow he stumbled across Gary Savage's daughter, one of the Majestic 12 grunts did. She was trying to break into the Ocean Labs, trying to get the UC components so that way she was trying to find the schematics for it, meaning like trying to find the blueprints so that way they could make their own UC, so Gary Savage could probably make the cure for the Grey Death. Because if you don't know, with what we know in Deus Ex, most of the ideas did make it in the final version. Yeah, while there were some things that were changed, but as far as Gary goes, Gary Savage was the leader of the remaining research department that used to work for Bob Page. And if it wasn't for J.C. Denton getting there when he did, along with Jock, his helicopter pilot, you know, they probably would have been dead. Because what was Bob Page trying to do? He was trying to get rid of the people that were basically a threat to him. So he was trying to fight them off, but what happened was they basically assassinated, captured, because he sent his own army in there. He sent Majestic 12 troops to basically try to kidnap them, override their security lock, and just kill them right where they stand. But they found out that, you know, when J.C. Denton landed on the roof, he managed to, you know, he was able to get the robots back on. He was able to get back into the components. He was able to fend off Majestic 12 all by himself, and even Majestic 12 couldn't understand like what they were doing wrong. All the people's lives that they were losing just to try to kill this one guy, and they couldn't stop him even when they wanted to. It's just amazing. But anyways, so what was it? Oh yeah, so that's where Paul also went wrong. He underestimated. He might have had the knowledge, but he underestimated what Majestic 12 was able to do too, under the right circumstances with the lore. So I think what happened was, you know, Paul. They got Paul early on because Paul was basically the first one to go almost. So they basically caught him before JC got involved. But before that, you know, he was going to stand up and say, hey, you know what, we're going to take this back somehow, you know. You know, they had more time to go after his augmentations and all that and weaken him drastically. But with JC, it was, you know, he went back to the NSF warehouse after Paul told him like all the things, and after the bribes he was receiving from Manderley and all that, from Walton Simons. Because if you read his logs, you know, the emails that Manderley was receiving was from WS, Walton Simons, for sure. But there's still Agent Sherman. I'm trying to remember who the hell was that. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. I want to know who that is because he said that. Well, we'll be sending Agent Sherman to keep an eye on you, but it's like they never say who Agent Sherman was. Sherman. But anyways, basically the way Majestic 12 goes is they had all these hand-me-downs from, you know, Deus Ex and all that, but and the Illuminati, but as time went on, eventually they flushed them out because you eventually found out who they really were and what they were capable of doing. And so later on, you know, we eventually found out that, you know, like they say with you know, secrets are power, you know, interrogations and whatnot. So Paul Denton's original mission was just secrecy for the most part. You know, he was trying to uncover, but he was also trying to backstab. He was trying to backstab Majestic 12. He was trying to backstab the Illuminati. He was trying to backstab the you know, what was it, UNACO for what they were doing to him, because he didn't trust any of them, especially in that line of work. But what's even crazier, if you really think about it, is, you know, was Paul, you know, and here's where it gets really confusing, if you really want to think about it, because this is just from the final version of the game. At the same time, though, the scrap levels and the scrap content they originally wanted to program, mind you, they already did this within 7 years. So you can kind of see why a lot of this was still impressive for its time. Because mind you, 2001 rolled around. This was right around the time. This was like one of the first PS2 games that came out. Let alone one of the, what was it? PC games. Okay. And it was also on the Macintosh computers, I believe. Never played I've only played the PS2 version right now, but I do want to go back and play like the mods and all that people have made of Deus Ex. I want to go see like just what people have created with it, see how different it really is. You know, even if it's not canon, but you know, you can kind of see like what somebody was getting at. So this is what I found out. So originally within the data of Deus Ex, and again, a lot of this stuff is, you can read this on like the cutting floor. I'll leave a link in the description. You can read all this, you know, if you really want to see, like, kind of get some ideas and think about this. There's a lot of lore that was cut from the game, and you can kind of get an idea of like what they were really getting at as far as the game's final development was going. So basically, without further ado, here we'll try to explain this. So the people that originally made Deus Ex were also a lot of the people that would eventually go off to make games like not too long ago, like System Shock or what was it, like they were, I believe they, I mean, I'm trying to remember based on the game's ending credits, like I think John Romero was even in there at one point. What was it? John Romero, the same John Romero that was revolutionizing first-person shooter games at the time. Like you had, what was it, Doom, Quake, Wolfenstein. I mean, mind you, John Romero was a hell of a guy back in the 90s. Like, this guy was, like, he create, if I am remembering this off my hands, off the top of my head, John Romero was the one that created the Unreal Engine. One of the very, very first successful, like, for as far as computer goes, you know, you were talking about, like, one of the most successful programs that was ever developed to creating said computer games back in the 90s and I mean the Unreal Engine has been updated multiple times, but it has definitely proven itself time and time again. And then you just had to have the most, you have to have like people that are really dedicated to programming. And while I'll be honest, I've never met John Romero in person, but I tell you what, I would love to. I'd really like to sit down and just be like, wow. But I mean, you also had well, but it was also, what was it, Warren Spencer? That was also the one that actually created Deus Ex, if I remember correctly. He was the one that wrote all the, like, he was the man, the one that wrote it all, like, or was one of them. He was one of the, he was somewhere in there. He was up there. But anyways, so basically, according to Warren himself, they stated that Paul Denton was originally supposed to have like more of a story as well. And we have evidence to prove that like you would later either join up with him or fight against him. And this could sort of be like, you know, they like, if you talk to a lot of people that have played Deus Ex, they will talk about and say that he originally was supposed to have a fourth ending in the game. You were either going to join up with Bob Page and then you could actually fight against everybody else and kill them. I can't imagine what else there probably would have been. It probably would have been something like that along the lines. Like, put it this way. I've never beaten Invisible War, but I've seen kind of how the endings were laid out. You might remember how there was like, at least 5 endings to Invisible War, where like the game literally gave you that decision where you could either fulfill J.C. Denton's requests and Paul Denton's. You had an ending where you literally killed them both and sided with the Templars, as in, the Knights Templars. And there was a bunch of other, or you didn't either. You did your own thing. Like, there was the neutral ending. There was, like, it just really made you think about the situation you were in. And this is even more confusing, but, then you also had, like, the scrap concept in the beta designs. Now, mind you, as far as, like, the command modules go, a lot of this stuff was reworked into the final version of Deus Ex, but it's possible that this stuff might actually be still in the game's programming somewhere, and if someone can figure out the correct scenario, it's possible there might be a lot of beta like audio files we haven't even found yet, possibly, but we're still looking for it. Like, the commands are there, but like we haven't found like how to activate them yet. So I'll give you an example. So as far as beta, like I said earlier, mission 7 and 13 were originally missing from the final version of Deus Ex, from what we understand. So the way it goes is you if you want to count like maybe at least 18 missions then, or 16. You had the training, which was the 0-0. You had 1, which was basically, you started with trying to raid the NSF off Liberty Island. You get into their headquarters, you get up to the top of the statue, and you basically would be like, okay, we took the leader, he's in custody now, or you kill him and they scold you for it, but he's dead then, and then the NSF start falling back because UNATCO moved in and overtook them. So they searched the bodies, they took the enemy ammunitions and guns, and they took them to they gave them to basically, what was it, Sam Carter, General Carter. Yeah, General Carter. Oh, no, yeah, Sam Carter, because he wasn't a general anymore. But anyways, so we find out, like, later on, like in Deus Ex, we find out originally that as far as the story goes, that, there was just a lot more they didn't develop. And so they basically had, like, you sort of see, like, where they were getting their ideas from like, what they previously didn't translate later on. Or at least they didn't finalize maybe in the games they wanted to. But it still does make you wonder, though, how much different was Deus Ex originally supposed to be? Like, whether the game itself was supposed to be a lot longer, or maybe some things were just changed because some ideas were previously scrapped. Like, let me give you an example. And some people might not know this, except for people that probably read about this. See, aside from the game having at least 4 or 5 endings, it's possible it could have been more. It's very possible that Deus Ex was originally not even supposed to be the way we thought it was. Think of it like, imagine fighting, the way the original game was supposed to be done was there was supposed to be like a White House mission, and they scrapped it because they thought it was kind of boring. And in a way, I can sort of see like the direction they were going in, why they probably thought, well, it wouldn't be a good idea. But I actually kind of thought it would have probably been a really cool concept, because that's where you were actually, like, because if you remember, like, in France, like, when there was that sniper's post, there's that newspaper you find there, and it talks about how the government was backtracking on its martial law, and it was going to say that now the entire U.S. government is now under martial law, and they're going to deport 6 million Americans into detention centers, including the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court. You might remember, again, the NSF interview that they were doing, interrogation they were doing with the 2 prisoners. Either you can kill them, and then, like, Walton Simons would scold you. He'd say, Jesus Christ, Denton. He's like, I was trying to conduct an investigation, He's like, this will go on your record, And that's what he was basically getting at. He was basically saying that they too had their own plan and could do what they wanted. And if anybody stood in their way, they'd shoot them dead right where they stood. That's what they were going to do with Paul. They were going to get rid of Paul because he knew too much. But later on, you found out that why were they hinting stuff like this aside from just the story of the game? Then you found out it was actually probably more content originally in Deus Ex. You actually would because think of it like this: they actually mentioned the president of the United States. President Mean? Anna Navarre said that President Mean has declared a national emergency, or shoot to kill, like all NSF, kill all the NSF members. And you know how Paul Denton felt about Anna Navarre. He's like, we can't have another Anna Navarre shooting spree, because she was a mech. She couldn't, like, once she started going, she didn't stop. She would, like, even though she was always saying about JC being able to clean the place out, like Castle Clinton being a graveyard, for example, you would also find out that, it stated basically that she was, able to do that same thing. She was not one to back down very easily. She would, like, kind of like Gunther. Gunther was in love with her too, but they basically were together. They were like a killing force. Because what did Gunther say? He killed like 1,000 people, and even to that day, he was still alive. He was a cyborg, but eventually he found his way back into the workforce. But eventually, even JC eventually killed him. Because what was it? Yeah, he killed him. He killed him because he didn't believe he was. He knew he'd fight to the death because he wanted to avenge Anna. Because he was going insane. Like I forget, like, what was it? Like, one of the diaries of the Majestic 12 troops that was actually in the Deus Ex, what was it? They were talking about how what was it? Like, they couldn't, like, they were talking about how Gunther was just sitting there staring at the wall very silently, not even making any noises, but occasionally you would hear him cry. Because he was slipping into insanity because JC killed Anna Navarre when he found out that she was going to kill Juan Lebedev, who actually told him that he was basically the one that basically told Paul, say, hey, listen, there's something wrong here. And I think that's where the whole conspiracy also began, because once Juan Lebedev caught on at what Tracer Tong was saying, he basically bought out. Because if you remember, Harley Philman mentioned before that there's some people at UNACO that get bought out. I didn't know who he was talking about at first, but because JC asks, like, who? And he's like, he's like, you can't afford that one. And who was he talking about? He probably was talking about his brother, because who got bought out shortly after? His brother, right? Didn't report back to you, NACO. The coalition shut off all his augmentations, and they said that the strike force even said that Paul Denton lost his nerve. So I feel like not only that, but it's like you're going back to Mission 13 though. It's, you found out that Paul Denton's story probably would have been explained a little bit more, because you would start realizing all the things. Like, the first half of the game was finding out that there's a conspiracy, and then the second half would be like you're finding out like how to deal with it. But here's where it gets confusing though, because one of the, like, as far as Mission 13 goes, you would go to the White House, try to save the president, and you find out this is when they're cloning things too, so the president's already been cloned, but where's the real president and his family? Somewhere and then there's like this underground bunker that can only be accessed through the White House and maybe somewhere else, I believe. So who knows how long it is. Again, government secrets. But here's where it gets interesting though. It's called Mount Weather. Not weather as in WH, but WEATHER. You can find the concept on the internet. It's really interesting. So you go there, you would find the White House would basically be like you'd basically be scrolling through what they thought was the White House and all its secrets and all that. You'd probably be fighting Majestic 12 and the Secret Service members and all that, and the Men in Black. And you would also be fighting. You'd eventually storm into the desk, the president's room, and then you probably right where, because I could see it like right now where like it's where Walton Simons is signing into paper. Like JC breaks the door down, like, with his gun loaded, and then all of a sudden, you know, he sees Walton Simon signing like one of the very last papers, so that way he can issue that Majestic 12 is officially going to conquer what they consider to be their, you know, their agenda. And then that's where you would fight Walton Simons to the death, you know, in the president's room for freedom. You know, take out the second highest in command of the lieutenant, and then try to negotiate. Yeah, you try to figure out what to do next. But here's where it gets interesting, though. So as far as the concept goes, you basically would find out that it's almost like Bob Page wasn't really the final boss then. Maybe Bob Page was actually supposed to be a lot different at the time. Or maybe Bob Page would have still been the final boss, but like they would have wrote this in a little bit later, though. Like, it's kind of interesting how it would have been a little different, though. Okay, so basically after you got out of Mount Weather, it would basically, or the bunker, you somewhere along the lines, you know, it would continue up until the point where like you would go to what the game would consider the ocean land, not the ocean land, but the trying to think, like, because there's a couple other missions that were scrapped entirely. I want to think that the game itself was still like the same up until a certain point. It's just a bunch of ideas that were just kind of changed around a little bit, but they were still kind of the same thing in the end. Like, for example, you know, you don't see the White House level, so basically you have like the silo, like you could have like the moon. There was supposed to be like a moon base too, like you go to the moon, and you would also go to there was like a missile launch that you would go to. Not the same silo where you stop the missile, but like there was also the like they sort of changed it around a little bit. So like originally, like you would have like the X-51. They could help you get into a rocket ship you'd launch into. I think it was like Titan 2 or something like that, which is based on a real rocket ship, believe it or not. And again, that's what's crazy about Deus Ex. Like, again, all the stuff that you see was based on something in real life in some way or another. That's how much realism they put into this. It's nuts. So anyways, once again, they took the Vandenberg X-51, which again is the airport, the military base that was just like 1 mile away from or somewhere in Rachel, Nevada, right outside of Area 51, sort of. It was its own base, yes, but it wasn't Area 51 necessarily. So again, the approach they took in Area 51 in the game was that, you know, like Jock was saying in the underground tavern when you first meet him, he says, well, he's like, I'm a pilot, which means I didn't get access to the Area 51 complex. He's like, but a lot of rock comes out of that place. He's like, but what I want to know is why is Echelon 4, the old, you know, surveillance. He says, why are they always laying more fiber optic cable lines there? And he's like, well, maybe they, and then JC was saying something along the lines like, you know, well, maybe they're doing it for like government secrecy or something, you know, something they have their reasons. And he's like, well, you know, and then Jock's like, well, I think I know. He's like, I think that's where they moved Echelon 4, Echelon 3, Echelon 4 programming when they said that they were going to promise to stop spying on the Americans. He's like, you know, because what do they want to do? The UN. They wanted to centralize every computer in all of existence, again, the way of the future, and they basically stated that, hey, they wanted to centralize everything because they knew everything, right? Or they wanted to. Because, like, again, you know, and that was another reason why Bob Page, one of his major weaknesses, was secrecy. Like, you know, because he controlled all of the communication. No matter where it was on the internet or they had, because, again, if you don't know, the internet was made basically by the military, but it evolved over time. That's why they always know your exact location, no matter what your ISP is. They still find a way to backlog it. But you can delay it even sooner if you know how to, you know. So basically that's the problem. They found a way to, as far as Bob Page goes, he was always good. That was the one thing he was always good at: secrecy and communication. He always knew what they were planning because they had no other choice but to put it on a communications center, right? So you had the Millinet, you had, or what was it, the Milnet, you had the encrypted files, and like even Alex Jacobson was even saying the same thing with when he designed UNAC with security himself. You know, that was basically the only thing they could do. They had to encrypt their messages and they had to send it back and forth, trying to make it sound like, hey, listen, you know, this isn't gonna work, but at the same time though, you know, we have to find a way to prevent, like, they basically had to find a way to prevent like Bob Page from gathering what they were planning next and what their location was, you know, buy themselves some more time. But once they found out Bob Page was actually also linked to the net, kind of like the Dark Age ending that you go for Tracer Tong. Tracer Tong was saying that you know, they were building their own grave. They dug their own grave, JC. He says, all we have to do is turn off these antimatter containers and cause Area 51 to just blow up, and it will. The UN dug their own grave because they put everything on the internet, and they centralized everything through those fiber optic cable lines. And eventually you found out that after you got into their facility, reverse engineered how they did the process, you actually destroyed every single thing that they built themselves. All that fiber optic cable line, gone. All the communications, gone. Everything's in a dark age. And yeah, it sent people back to the Stone Age almost. But it would have been like, well, there goes the centralization for all the big businesses in a way. So now they had to start all over again. Well, everybody had to start all over again. But it was actually interesting how they took that approach in that sense. Which I kind of think the Dark Age ending probably would have been a lot more darker because, you know, you're talking about even more riots and more people are going to start fighting each other again. Back in the day, you just got a population that's even bigger. So in a way, it's kind of a lot more ambiguous than the original, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So yeah, I think the way I'm looking at it. So as far as Bob Page goes, you know, I don't think Bob Page was really like, you know, because in the original concept, the way it worked was, you know, you were actually supposed to go to Vandenberg, and then somewhere along the lines, you would eventually find a way to get into a rocket. You would go to the moon, and you would be on the moon base, and then later on, there was like the moon base. You would have like a space station you would go to, and then there was the moon base itself, and then the entity Helios, and then there was supposed to be someone named Adam that was there too. And there was like another person you were trying to stop. I think this is when they changed it to Bob Page, sort of. Or maybe Bob Page could have been a different character at the time. Again, who knows? Like, again, this is where it gets confusing because, again, you know, unless we have like a final version to prove, we might not really know like exactly what, you know, we might not really know offhand who's doing what, you know. So, but basically this is what I do know though. So basically as far as those 4 levels go, again, the White House, Mount Weather, the moon base, and then finally the space station and the moon base, it basically would have been along the lines like it was basically turning into like System Shock all of a sudden. And some of the game designers said, because if you don't know, System Shock was a game that was released kind of by the same people, I believe so. Before another company obtained the rights to it. But what's really interesting though is System Shock was well done for its time. Like, I mean, even though it's a completely different game, if you've never played it before, you should check it out. It really does have like a really interesting concept for the time it was released. Basically, there's like this very, very, very corrupt, self-aware super AI machine. Also, what was it, Shodan, who basically, which was a female, sort of. Well, you could say it's still an it, technically. But she basically was like a supercomputer AI to the point where she was so self-aware, she was trying to find a way to merge herself into like a godhood, sort of. But at the same time, though, she had found a way to, like, turn and kill basically everybody that was still alive on the space station into zombies or just altogether annihilate them. However, you play as a hacker who was able to like if I remember correctly, you were able to survive a lot of the stuff that she had already tried on everybody else, but at the same time you were still trying to find a way to override her safety commands, which were scattered all around the ship, and you had to find a way to not only fight her all the way up until the end, but you also had to find a way to reverse engineer her programming and then finally delete her from, doing what she's done. And believe it or not, it's actually very interesting how that worked out for its time. The layouts, the combat, the puzzles, it just really worked out for its time. And if they ever do make more System Shock games, I'd be very interested, because I do think. But it's like, that's, according to the game designers, that's kind of like the approach they wanted to take at the time, because one of the reasons they started developing Deus Ex was because of games like System Shock and, first-person shooter games like what John Romero was going through. There's a lot of influence there from but you have to understand though, Deus Ex began progress, if I remember correctly. It was a 7-year development from 1994-ish, and then they finally released it in 2001. Although what's really interesting is one of the very first alpha builds that we were able to find was from 1998, 1997. So the main game was done, but they went back and edited everything they wanted in another 4 or 3 years. I'll be honest with you, I'm not much of a programmer, but based on the knowledge I try to seek, it's kind of actually really amazing how much you can learn just from looking at a lot of the projects that people have already created. And that's what I've learned. So, again, I'll find more information, but so far I do believe that was the approach they originally wanted to take with Deus Ex, but because they changed the concept of the ending. Basically, what we found out was that they scrapped the White House, they scrapped Mount Weather, they scrapped the moon base, they scrapped the space station, and we found out later on, and maybe there was some other stuff too they might have scrapped too, but it's really interesting because instead what we got was, you might remember how after you save Tiffany from the old Vandenberg gas station, you might find out how they talk about how they're going back to Gary Savage, but then the next mission it just immediately loads right into the ocean lab, and it taught as if you already met with Gary, a certain amount of time has passed. So that might be when that mission started, was right in that vicinity. But here's where it gets even more confusing. So now you start to find out that maybe as far as mission 14 and 15 goes, again, you have the Vandenberg missile, you have the silo, you had and then finally you had Area 51 after that, the last level in the game, which was kill Bob Page, and then maybe do a couple other things. But here's where it gets really confusing though. You see, it's very possible that a lot of the stuff that they got into the final version of the games was actually recycled into the Ocean Lab, the stuff that was originally supposed to be for the moon base and all that. Because again, these were all assets. They were done. They might have looked a lot different, but they probably finalized them and used them for something else. Because again, when you're designing something that you love, and again, you look at how the game designers really put a lot of effort into Deus Ex. It's possible that why would they just want to throw all the ideas away? They had a lot of ideas, they had a lot of brainstorming, but they did a lot of recycling too. A lot of reused assets that were originally supposed to probably be for something else. And even to this day, I still think, no matter how many times I play the original Deus Ex, I still think I'm missing stuff in that game, because that's how complex it is. There's so many different ways to do things. You could just just talking to certain people out of order, and you've already got some dialogue that you might miss because you did something that you weren't supposed to do, or you did something a little later on that somebody tells you about that you might not know a little later on. So they definitely thought about it ahead of time, and I feel like the AI in some ways kind of scares me, because they do things that you're not really supposed to know about. Like, they don't just run in circles, and like the game knows certain things. It kind of makes you wonder how, like, kind of reminds me of, like, if anybody's ever remembered, like, you know, the game Cubert and how they tested it with that super AI computer. The game was doing things that even the game designers didn't even know they could do in that game. So how was it that the game, like, it just goes to show you that computer AI is a lot more advanced than we think it is, you know? Not just the way the game designers program it, but like when the game is left to like think for itself, you know, the things it comes up with actually might surprise you. So that's actually kind of interesting. Self-aware AI, like Skynet from what was it? Not Deus Ex, but Terminator. Terminator's here. Again, Arnold Schwarzenegger would like he would say, you know, Skynet was very, 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 very self-aware. But or even kind of reminds me of Terminator, not Terminator. What was it? What was it? The cop, the RoboCop. Yeah, RoboCop. You know, like when he became a cyborg. You know, he just like all this AI was becoming self-aware. He knew things. He was able to look in his data log and knew what to look for. He was programmed well. They said we have the technology. But anyways, yeah, this video is kind of long, but anyways, yeah, I do think that no matter how much data we find with Deus Ex, and no matter what Paul Denton's mission originally was, I do think that a lot of the concepts that they had came out with still made sense in the end. Especially, I'll be honest, I'm actually thinking about this video right now. Unedited, I think I did a really good job. But I think that's basically it for right now. I do believe that a lot of the ideas they had were recycled into something else. And at the same time, it does kind of make sense, you know? But I do want to know, though, if somebody does ever rebuild Deus Ex based on whatever assets we can originally find based on the command settings, is it possible that maybe there's a lot of beta audio files that are still out there that we don't know, like with Walton Simons or Paul Denton or even JC himself, you know, that maybe we're not seeing that never got leaked? Because there were videos on YouTube, and I believe there still are, of like, you can see like the ones that are in the final version of the game, but if we can get like a later build, like we can kind of like see like maybe there's some other ones that we didn't ever get that maybe might, you know, just to like, again, lost history rather, you know, prototype data or whatever you want to call it, you know, we'll see. But anyways, subscribe if you're not. I'll keep researching, seeing what I find, and we'll go from there. But right now, I do believe that Deus Ex is in itself a very confusing game, but that's how deep the lore goes, though. And again, that's really the best I can explain it right now. There's a lot of stuff you can easily miss, and even people that are keeping track of the stuff seem to may not have found everything yet. But we'll do the best we can, though. But yeah, I do think that if Deus Ex was originally supposed to be as different as it originally was, it was supposed to be different in the sense that we are just supposed to find out. We just have to compare it to like an older version and see what they changed and what maybe they didn't. And if possible, let's see if we can rebuild what we have with the mods. Because if the programming is in still, like, whether it's the final version but it's in the game's coding somewhere, I mean, you're gonna have to ask somebody who really knows how to find this stuff, that, you know, what they found, because I couldn't explain it. You know, I'm not a coder, I'm not a programmer, but with my limited knowledge of programming, I tell you what, man, you are a genius, an absolute genius. You can make sense of this stuff, especially for a project that most people didn't even design. You know, yeah, that's even more impressive. So yeah, we'll have to, if I find anything else about this, I'll definitely make more videos. But until that time comes, you know, I hope this kind of, you know, shows us like where we're at right now. You know, I think Paul Denton, aside from like Bob Page, ironically, had a story that was probably even more mysterious than like most of the characters, if not all of them, in Deus Ex, you know, because Paul Denton was not just a double agent, but basically you see the reason for the long explanation, you know, if you know, because I'm sure at one point when you're playing that game, you're trying to figure out who, not only who was Paul Denton, but what else did he know that wasn't obvious offhand. You know, that's something to think about next time you play that game.